Activities of Canada-based Khalistani elements continue to promote a violent extremist agenda. Wow, right out of the gate, that is a stark, direct warning pulled straight from the newly released 2025 Canadian Security Intelligence Service report. It's the kind of bold statement that just instantly pulls us into a really complex web of national security, historical trauma, and high-stakes international diplomacy. Welcome to The Explainer. I'm so pumped to dive into this with you today because we're tackling a fascinating and, let's be honest, incredibly sensitive topic. We're going to decode this 2025 Canadian Intelligence Report. We'll unpack its findings on extremism and peel back the layers of the sometimes totally contradictory international diplomacy surrounding it. If you've ever wanted to understand the real-world friction between intelligence gathering and actual law enforcement realities, you are in exactly the right place.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. We're going to start inside the CCIS report itself, trace the historical context, look at claims of foreign interference, explore a pretty surprising counter-perspective from the RCMP, and finally wrap up with the geopolitical tensions.
All right, moving into Part 1, inside the CSIS report, focusing on domestic threats. So let's look at what Canadian intelligence is actually observing right here at home. The core thesis of the 2025 CSIS report doesn't beat around the bush. It formally identifies Canada-based Khalistani extremists, or CBKEs, as the agency calls them, as an ongoing national security threat to Canada. This isn't just some vague, generalized warning. It's a highly specific identification of a domestic faction that intelligence officials say needs continuous, strict monitoring. Now, you might be wondering, how exactly do these groups supposedly operate? Well, CSIS lays out a specific playbook. They allege these elements connect with well-intentioned Canadian citizens, leverage local institutions, and collect funds from completely unsuspecting community members. And the endgame? The report claims those funds get diverted toward violent extremist activities. But, and this is a really vital caveat we have to keep in mind, the report explicitly notes there were actually no related attacks within Canada in 2025. Okay, Part 2, the historical context, the shadows of 1985. 329. Let that number sink in for a second. That is the devastating number of lives lost in the 1985 bombing of Air India Flight 182. And the vast majority of those victims, they were Canadians. The CSIS report deliberately points out that the suspects in this absolute tragedy were members of Canada-based Khalistani extremist groups. Even now, 40 years later, it remains the deadliest terrorist attack in Canadian history. It's this massive, dark shadow that completely informs modern Canadian security policy.
Let's move to and see how this builds across a 40-year timeline. We've got that tragic baseline of the 1985 Air India bombing. Then, fast forward to 2023, and tensions absolutely skyrocket with the killing of NIA-designated terrorist Hardeep Singh Jijjar outside a Canadian Gurdwara. Fast forward again to 2025, and boom, the release of this highly scrutinized CSI's intelligence report. It's like a giant puzzle, and seeing the timeline really helps explain how past violence directly fuels the intelligence priorities and the high alert status we're seeing today.
That brings us to Part 3, claims of foreign interference from global actors.
Now, what's really interesting about this is just how crowded the field is. The CSIS report isn't just pointing a finger at one single nation. Because of how wild global geopolitics are right now, they actually list 5 main perpetrators of foreign interference and espionage against Canada. We're talking about China, Russia, India, Iran, and Pakistan. So it's a very multipolar threat landscape trying to pull the strings of Canadian politics.
To really grasp the allegations specifically involving India, we have to define a huge intelligence buzzword that pops up constantly in this report: transnational repression, or TNR. Simply put, this means coercive tactics and surveillance meant to suppress criticism of a foreign government and create fear within a specific diaspora community. This is the exact specific language Canadian intelligence is using right now.
So tying it all together, the CSIS report explicitly alleges that historically, India has cultivated these covert relationships with Canadian politicians, journalists, and members of the Indo-Canadian community. And the goal here? They claim it's to exert influence, advance their own interests, and counter Khalistan separatism using those exact transnational repression tactics we just talked about. The intelligence agency is basically waving a red flag, urging extreme vigilance.
Let's jump into Part 4. The RCMP counter-perspective, differing assessments.
But wait, does all of Canadian law enforcement actually agree with this intelligence assessment? Because this is where the story takes a massive turn.
Under the current administration of Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canadian officials have a remarkably different view. Right before Prime Minister Carney's recent trip to India, officials stated they believe India is actually not currently linked to violent crimes or threats on Canadian soil. I mean, that is a huge rhetorical pivot from the intelligence warnings we just looked at.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer internal friction happening right now. It's a real split screen. On one side, you've got CSIS, the intelligence wing, sounding the alarm about India's covert relationships and active transnational repression. But then, on the exact opposite side, you have the RCMP, the actual law enforcement wing, assessing that the current, hard evidence simply doesn't connect the dots back to a foreign state.
To really hammer this counter-perspective home, let's look at the exact words from RCMP Commissioner Mike Duhaime. He said, and I quote, "What we're seeing right now in transnational repression, the dots don't always connect to a foreign entity." He went on to clarify that earlier statements from 2024 about government proxies, well, those were tied to a very specific, isolated criminal file at the time. Today, the top cop in Canada is essentially saying there is no immediate threat to Canadians from any Indian-linked agent.
Finally, Part 5. Geopolitical tensions, the fallout.
As you might guess, the Indian government's reaction to this CSIS report has been swift and totally categorical. They have strongly, absolutely rejected all allegations of foreign interference. In fact, they've dismissed the claims as being strictly politically motivated. This firm denial is a massive piece of the puzzle here, representing a complete, flat-out rejection of the entire Canadian intelligence narrative.
So, the crucial point is this fundamental ideological and legal disconnect that is fueling all this diplomatic fire. Think about it. On one side, India is acting forcefully to counter what it sees as an existential threat to its own domestic stability, which absolutely includes Khalistan separatism. But then over in Canada, the government operates under a legal framework that considers advocating for Khalistan to be perfectly lawful, protected political activity. They are literally looking at the exact same issue through two completely incompatible lenses.
Which brings us to the ultimate question of this whole explainer. How on earth does a nation navigate delicate international diplomacy when its own intelligence agencies are actively sounding the alarm on foreign interference, but its top law enforcement officials are saying, hey, the current evidence doesn't point to a foreign entity? It's an absolutely fascinating look at statecraft, intelligence gathering, and legal thresholds. I really hope this breakdown helped untangle the complexities of the 2025 CSIS report. Thanks for learning with me today, and keep asking those hard questions.